Welcome to a lecture, a university lecture on Bleeding Kansas. Now, I'm sure Bleeding Kansas is something that has not crossed your mind since, well, junior high school, if you even remember it. But it's a very important part of American history because, as I say, it's the first flames of the Civil War. Um, the Bleeding Kansas, in its day was one of the most important things that happened to the nation as it moves toward the Civil War. And of course, it was based on the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which was an attempt to run railroads from the East Coast to the West Coast. And, you need to organize the Kansas-Nebraska territories by government. And it makes sense to do so. But what happened is every time Congress got involved in the issue of slavery, bad things happened. And some of you may remember that in the 1850 Compromise, a gun was pulled on one representative pulled a gun on another representative on the floor of Congress. Um, and so since things got so tangled up in Congress, they decided that they would let the people decide whether the Kansas territory or the Nebraska territory would be slave. What, after all, could go wrong with having the people vote on something like this? And so what happened, of course, was that on the first set of votes, what are called the Border Ruffians came across the border from Missouri. Now, Missouri was a slave state. About 1/6 of its population was slave, and they certainly wanted a friendly slave state next to it, or in this case, a territory. And so people from Missouri simply flooded over the border and voted in the first set of elections for slave candidates and slave ideas. And it turns out, of course, that from that election, it would be expected that you would have a slave constitution, a pro-slave constitution. Now, was the vote fraudulent? It was probably insanely fraudulent. But nevertheless, you have a vote. But those people who were anti-slave, Northern abolitionists, and you can see that the term here evolves from those who wanted to abolish slavery, responded by attempting to pour their own voters into Kansas. Now, so far as we know, and notice how cautious I am being about this, only about 1,200 free soilers, that is, anti-slave advocates, came in. And this is not a firm number. Kind of hard to count. Can do a better job of counting the Border Ruffians, as they were called, than we can count the free soilers. But nevertheless, let's assume that that's pretty much correct. Now, the free soilers certainly knew that the Border Ruffians were armed. That is, the folks from Missouri who came into Kansas were armed. And so the free soilers decided to arm themselves. The rifles used by the free soilers, which were called sharps, were shipped in at least one instance into the territory labeled as books. Well, the box was about 4 feet long by about 12 inches wide by about 12 inches deep. You don't generally ship Bibles and books and things like that in a crate like that. But a New England minister, a very prominent New England minister by the name of Henry Ward Beecher, believed that such rifles could do God's work by helping to eliminate slavery. Beecher believed that by arming the free soilers, by gosh, you could achieve what Jesus wanted to achieve. Now, I'm not aware of the passage in Scripture in which it says, take sharp rifles and shoot your enemies. But nevertheless, that's what Beecher believed. And so the rifles that came in with the free soilers are named Beecher's rifles. Then they held an election to choose a territory legislature. Well, what could go wrong there? The election ended with charge and countercharge of fraud. People were thrown out of their seats, and investigations happened, and committees showed up, and it was a complete disaster. The U.S. government lost control of the situation, and not too surprisingly, violence broke out, hence the name Bleeding Kansas. Two different Kansas governments emerged. One that was a free government against slavery in Topeka, one a slave government in a place called Shawnee Mission. Later on, they moved it to a place called Lecompton. President Franklin Pierce, although he was from New Hampshire, which of course is a very strongly anti-slavery state, recognized a slave government, and that's kind of a legal reason to do so, although I don't know that this was one of his best decisions. Not too unpredictably, all hell broke loose. You know, people get shot, as we've seen in George Washington and what happened after the Battle of Trenton. Guerrilla warfare works out really well, and you can do lots of damage by shooting people from ambush and stuff like that. And that's what happened in Kansas. There's no real reason to go into the details of the endless violence that played out. The two governments and their supporters, mostly their supporters, the governments were pretty weak, fought back and forth. Lawrence, Kansas, which was a free town, was attacked and partly destroyed by slave forces. Ironically, or maybe not so ironically, one of the places that the pro-slave forces burned down was the Free Soil Hotel, which I think is all the summary you need about that. But the idea that Lawrence had been burned down, had been sacked, as the phrase goes, stayed with the Free Soilers, and of course, one gentleman is particularly anxious to avenge Lawrence, and his name, of course, and we will hear of him again, was John Brown. Okay, John Brown saw himself as the agent of God, you know, the representative of God, who to do away with slavery. And he and his sons and some followers hacked 5 men to death with broadswords or machetes at a pro-slavery place called Potawatomi. Now, again, I'm not really familiar with the part of the Bible where it says that you shall hack your enemies to death with machetes, but nevertheless, that's what happened. And the violence spiraled out of control. It continued on. 1859, 1860, you get kind of a peace within Kansas, but in reality, what really happens is that it doesn't really stop for a very long time. Into the 1870s, 1880s, as late as the 1930s, there were raids and counter raids back and forth between the two regions, although they would find reasons besides slavery, which had long since ended, to battle back and forth. And even to this day, the fall football game between the University of Missouri and the University of Kansas is called the Border War. I don't think anybody remembers why it's called the Border War, but it's a game that's played with considerable violence, and it's not necessarily a very clean game. And people know the Border War is not a clean game, and I think they've all forgotten why it isn't. But they continue to reenact the Civil War resentments. So I was in Kansas and Missouri in 2019, and some of that resentment still exists, which says something about how long history lasts. Maybe it's not over when it's over. So anyway, thank you, and we'll move on to our next lecture.